Good afternoon. Thank you, Bert. I'm delighted to be here. Some of you know that I've been here on and off for a number of years, and I can't think of a place that it's more like a homecoming for me than to come here and to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Center for Service Learning and Civic Engagement. In fact, I'm one of those people whose only record of my life is my CV, because I've moved so much that everything's in boxes. And I looked at my CV in preparation for this and realized that the first time I was here was September 1986, I think at the invitation of Mary Eden. So that means, and I don't know if this is the scary part or the wonderful part, that for 22 of the last 40 years I've been, as a guest, a speaker, a researcher, and collaborator, part of the work here at Michigan State. So thank you again for inviting me. You'll bear with me. I've got a brand new toy here, so we'll see if we know how to use it. I think what's significant about this event is that, as Bert said, indeed, it is the oldest service learning center in the country. And as Karen and I were getting ready to put the material together, I said, well, you know, maybe there's another one out there. Let's be academics and just say possibly or most likely or probably. But the more I look and the more of the research I've done, the really, I suppose this is a challenge, but unless some article shows up in the Chronicle of Higher Ed in the next day or so, I really don't believe it'll be challenged. So the first thing I want to say before moving into my remarks is congratulations to all of you who've done this. Oh, I hit the wrong button. Can you get it back on show? Oh, thank you. Okay. First, a technical footnote. The celebrations are when people decide to have them, and as we know from reading texts from periods of time when they didn't have atomic clocks and more precise ways of keeping time. For those of us who've read Joseph Campbell or listened to Moyers, there's a phrase, in that time, or in those times. So the footnote here is that we're celebrating 1968, as we should, because it's 2008, but in a technical sense we're also thinking about 1967, which is when the proposal from some graduate students here then went to the Board of Trustees of Michigan State University. So when I say, and I'll show you, there were some things happening nationally coincidentally in 1967 and 1968, but I will just use 1968 as shorthand for 67, 68, or probably in some cases in those times. I was going back over my notes the other day, and I realized, even looking at some of the primary sources, that sometimes the same people in two different occasions gave me two different dates when something happened. But another word about 1968. First of all, when many of us think of 1968, we don't think of what I think would have been the innocence of January. We think more of the terrible times in April, the violence in August. And so I think that what's interesting is, first of all, this comes before that. And secondly, I'm one of those people who remembers exactly where I was and what I was doing on the evening of April 4th, 1968. So, and as I'll show in a minute, it's hard to speak about the history of service learning at Michigan State or anywhere else without acknowledging the case of Michigan State, very direct ties to Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. But really, nationally, the movement had many of its roots in civil rights. And so, just a reminder that 2 days from now, we do need to commemorate April 4th, even as we celebrate January 68 today. I'm familiar with some of the uses of the number 40 in the Judeo-Christian traditions, but then I turn to that great scholarly source, don't tell my students I said this, Wikipedia, and and discovered the meaning, the many, many uses and meanings of the number 40. In fact, as I was excitedly sharing these with someone who knows me, said, you know, be careful or you'll end up spending the whole time reflecting on the meaning of the number 40. But there are really two meanings, I think, that are important for what we're doing today. One is that 40 is a long time. And obviously, in early stories and myths and religious stories and origins, the number 40 is probably less precise and more interpretive and more meaningful. And about 6 or 7 of the world's religions have at least one important use of the number 40. And one of the other meanings of the number 40 is it's a time of transition. It's a time of moving from one place to another. It's a time of weathering some kind of trial or tribulation. In some religions, it's the time set for mourning. In others, it's actually the number of punishments meted out. But I think, you know, we all kind of wait for 50th, and 25 and 50 seem to be the anniversaries in our culture. And I want to say that I think 40 in some ways, in a broad sense, is as important, if not more important. So indeed, this is a long time. It's actually those of us who've been around higher ed for a long time know it's a long time for anything to last that long. So that's just a couple notes on that. It's counterintuitive. You'll point here and it works there. Anyway, my perspective is in part that of an insider here at Michigan State, the extent to which someone who's a participant observer and comes in and out of town, coming back to be among friends and good colleagues, but also someone who's been personally involved in the service learning movement, not quite 40 years, but a few years. So if you're expecting a very critical look, probably you won't get it from me, because I think we're here to be inspired by this work as well as to get some information and some thoughts about the future. The data that I want to base my talk on today will come from two things. One is a book that Bert mentioned, and I have it here because I'll be reading some quotes, but it was a study that my colleagues and I did on the pioneers of service learning, and it was set up as an oral history project as well as a participatory action research project. And I won't bore you with the methodology, but essentially we captured the stories of 33 of the pioneers in service learning who were working from the early 60s on until 1985, who had started as late as 1985, and it was a project we did in 1995. And as part of that project, I interviewed two of the people who are here today, Mary Edens and John Dooley, as well as others around the country. And the other source of data is I've been immersing myself in the documents that are behind the tableau of history that are here in terms of the history at Michigan State, although much of which I knew from, I did a 3-hour interview with Mary Edens in 1996 as part of this research on pioneers. My scope today is this will not be a lecture on history. For those of you who are historians will soon discover I'm not trained in historiography. And also, another reason for this not to be a lecture in history is that the difficulty I mentioned a few minutes earlier about getting the numbers and the dates right. But this is not about chronology. This is about events, sequences, and meaning. So what I would like to do in the few minutes that I have is to simply highlight some of the pioneers, some of the programs, and what I see as some of the promise and also some of the challenges of service learning, and to try to do that in somewhat of a parallel fashion, showing, working on a thesis about the relationship of local programs to the national movement in service learning, and to do that back and forth and to highlight some of that. So that will be the limit then of the scope of this, is that it will not be history. For the you have history in your packets, and also you have that you can look at later on. There is a 100-and-some-year timeline of the origin of service learning in American society. It's Appendix B from this pioneer book written by Bob Sigmund, who was one of the people who was in the room when they were coining the term. service learning. 1967, you have this, I think, in some of your history. I know this, the print is a little small, but essentially this is the resolution that went to the Board of Trustees in 1967 and was approved for starting the Service Learning Center in 1968. What I find unique about this very founding document, which I think in retrospect in some ways could be seen as predictive of what's happened. I've looked at a number of these documents that set up volunteer centers, and very few of them have the kinds of statements that this one has. And one is the first sentence about the coordination of volunteer programs, that's fairly standard, with the general academic program of the university. And I think looking back, it's easy to see that there lies the seeds of some of service learning. That from the beginning, the resolution was that volunteer programs would be coordinated with the general academic program of the university. And I would argue that's probably part of one of the many factors of the success for the program here at Michigan State. The other one in that same vein that I find equally unique is number 11, to coordinate educational and research programs. Obviously, these are boundary crossing or boundary spanning or domain crossing kinds of statements. In fact, at many institutions, they're still trying to figure out how to cross those domains. At the same time, 1966 or 67, this is one of those dates that varies, but at the Oak Ridge Institute for Nuclear Studies, and it's a long story why service learning was invented in a nuclear plant, but in a government nuclear facility, but it was. Any of you ever been to Oak Ridge? Yeah, it doesn't quite look like Chernobyl, but there are many of those scary yellow and black signs, right? Okay, I don't know if they were there in 1967 or not, but they had a mission. One of their missions, in addition to be the point laboratory for the U.S. government's development of nuclear technology, was community development and economic development. And Bill Ramsey and Bob Sigmund decided that one of the places to turn for person power was to the universities. And this is an interview with Bill Ramsey as part of this project in terms of reflecting on why they called it service learning. And there's a long discussion. It's almost kind of like a cartoon. Shall we call it this? Shall we call it that? And as they rejected each term. But I think the key point is to link action with the value of reflection on that action, a disciplined reflection. And that certainly fits with the words from President Hanna that the provost just read to us. And so, interestingly enough, there in 1967, I assume unbeknownst that there would be no link, certainly no internet link between East Lansing, Michigan, or the State House in Lansing, and Oak Ridge Nuclear Studies, was this very similar and parallel development, one on the national level and one here, although I think that's a fairly false distinction, as I'll say more in a minute. Most recently, I was asked, along with two colleagues, to help put together a slightly different history, a book chapter on the history of the service learning movement. And I'm never sure to be flattered or just think, well, you know, there's few people around who probably remember most of these things if we can't find the documents. But my colleagues, Rob Schumer of the University of Minnesota and Tim Stanton from Stanford, and we've put together a book chapter that'll be coming out by Sage. And we were asked to think about the intellectual precursors of the service learning movement. And so it seemed to us that these are really the three big ideas, as the editor asked us to put together. The big ideas, or I like the idea of pillars, and they're the pillars of the common good, contested as it may be in our time, but also civil society, certainly again connecting to President Hanna's notion of citizen scholar, and also learning by doing. Those of you who look at the history will see that much of what we do now under the name service learning had a variety of terms, including experiential learning, which is probably the academic 50-cent version of simply learning by doing. As you heard from the abstract that Bert read, this is really the thesis that I want to explore this afternoon. It's easy now to talk about service learning as a national or indeed an international movement, and it has broadened as the Service Learning Center here has here in the last 5 years to become the Center for Service Learning and Civic Engagement. But while there are many national manifestations of this work, I'm arguing that there really is, apart from the individual and local programs, there really is no national movement. If you look carefully at how things came on the national scene, that they came from practitioners practicing locally, networking, coming together, and then sharing that practice. And so that's the idea underneath the contention that I'm making, that a major part of the national practice and the national movement has been shaped by the work at Michigan State, that it really is local work that has become collective and recognized nationally. We know that certainly one of the roots of the civil rights movement is the work that Miles Horton did at Highlander, and in the collection of essays that he and Paulo Freire did, the title is "We Make the Road by Walking." And I think if you look at the banners or read any of the history of service learning, it is clearly true that people did make the road by walking. Also, I would note here that Miles Horton's autobiography is called The Long Haul. So I think those are just two background ideas. So the first of the three Ps this afternoon, what about the pioneers? Sounds like one of those Garrison Keillor little scenarios that he does, the lives of the pioneers. First, let's talk a little bit about the pioneers here at Michigan State. And I've put them in two categories. And this is one of those places where humility reigns. So I've tried to acknowledge fallibility and humility by talking about unsung. So in the celebration, in the naming, it's important to remember, and I was talking with Mary Edens today saying, you know, I wonder if we could collect the names of all those early faculty members in the 60s and 70s who had their students doing work as part of courses, probably much of it before or the Service Learning Center or the Volunteer Bureau, and then Service Learning Center was established, or even in the early days. But I think it's important as we name people, as we try to get a sense of the key actors in the history, to know that there were the student volunteers, there were the student activists, there were many community partners. Some of the directors of the Service Learning Center came from the community. Some of the early requests, can the university do this or that, came from students, as I said, but also with community partners. Graduate students have been an important part of the Center for Service Learning. At least 3 of the people who registered us today are graduate students. There are some faculty in this room who started out as graduate students in the Service Learning Office. And I know it's easy for us to think of graduate students as our free and not cheap, but free labor for many of these endeavors. But in the case of the Center for Service Learning, many of the graduate students were the idea people, the people who got it done, who thought about it and made it happen, not just the people who did what the director said. One of the parts of faculty culture in higher ed is we don't often like to acknowledge the role of administrators. In fact, sometimes we talk about our colleagues going over to the dark side when they become, our faculty colleagues become administrators. And in my campus, when someone becomes a director, as I did last year, the phrase is congratulations, or is it condolences? But the history here of the pioneers at Michigan State is clear, as it was many other places, that there was leadership, there was administrative leadership, central administration across colleges, and even in other programs that supported this. So part of the unsung is that. I've mentioned the faculty. I think the Board of Trustees, I'm not sure, somebody probably knows where there's a record of who was on the Board of Trustees that day. And when this was discussed and debated and why it was done. But I think it's important to acknowledge that kind of leadership and policy and direction role of the board that set up the center. And also, by directors and assistant directors, I'm talking about the directors in the office. And again, certainly there have been a number of directors and assistant directors. I was just asking Georgia Davidson today how long she'd been assistant director in the office, and she said 17 years. So I think that it's important to realize that what it takes and what has taken over the years for this work to get done. Some of the visible pioneers, certainly any of the accounts here credit your Governor Romney, and I'll tell you why I'm making that distinction in a minute. Governor George Romney for starting and promoting volunteerism in 1960 and envisioning higher education as having a role in the needs of the state. I say that because in Massachusetts, we've just sent on a governor who felt that higher education, public higher education's role was to diminish itself rather than to serve in any meaningful way. We look at Jim Tank and Maxie Jackson. They were, as far as we can tell, the two leading graduate students who took the proposal to the Board of Trustees and wanted to move from a volunteer bureau to a broader office. Judith Sorum Brown, who was one of those assistant directors who went on to the University of Maryland and is one of the people who was nominated for our study on pioneers. I believe she was probably known as Judy Sorum when she was here. And John Dooley, whom I'll say more about later. Mary Edens. And I mentioned that of students, but one I wanted to mention in particular that whom I heard speak here in the 1990s, and that was Darren Day, who was responsible in some ways for some of the new directions of the program and of the office. Well, if I haven't convinced you yet of my thesis, I think here's the evidence, this first point. Do the math. If 10% of the 33 pioneers in this movement came from Michigan State, I think everything else I've said probably is secondary to that point. And those pioneers are, of course, who were, again, met the criteria for the study, were visibly known to have started this work before 1985, were John Dooley, Mary Edens, and Judy Sorum Brown. One of the characteristics that we pulled from the data of interviewing the pioneers and the question of how did you know to do that? No, there really were no models. And it was the idea that people had a compass. I just got an electronic compass from my car and realized if I'm not careful, I have to reset true north about every couple weeks. But with no road maps, or to use Miles Horton, we make the path by walking, but they had a compass and they knew the direction, and there are wonderful quotes in the literature as to what their values were, why they did this, where they were going, but how they would get there was unknown. One of the interesting parts of bringing the pioneers together at a conference at the Wingspread Conference Center in Racine a few years ago is that there were probably N+1 motives as there were pioneers of the reasons people did this. So the motives were highly varied. Some were concerned about social justice, others social action, others volunteerism, others reforming higher education. What was interesting is, given different motives and even some different paths, the agreement on values and the purpose of this work and the main direction. As Bert noted, the subtitle of our work today is From the Margins to the Mainstream. And this was one of the debates. In fact, I think we left the meeting unconvinced, or certainly not having a consensus of whether a work that had been so vital and had grown so much on the margins of the American Academy, and that what would happen to it as it moved into the mainstream. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But this was certainly one of the characteristics of the pioneers. I remember years ago, before there was email, John Dooley mailing me an article that he was working on, and I think the working title was "Margins Are Real Places." And so economists point out that margins are important when thinking about profits. And those of us who grade papers, until we had track changes, know that the margins were often where we dialogued with our students outside of the framework. I think one of the key characteristics of the pioneers was the ability to be reflexive and to be flexible. I mentioned earlier that in the records from and the interviews about the history here was the influence of students in general, but of one particular student. And this is an interview with Mary Edens that actually I did in 1996. And Mary, talking about the evolution of the program, said, "I learned a lot from Darren Day. He challenged me and taught me two things. One is that we can get stuck in our own pedagogy, our own theory of how to do this work. The other was to continue to be very creative, continue to be open to new ways that people can associate, especially students, to essentially ask the question, how do we work with students in a way that reflects the kind of partnership that they and we need to have with our community agencies?" And the interviews are full of this kind of view, where people reframed what they were doing, refined it, and responded to both students and to community partners. The pioneers, I think it goes without saying, were risk takers, and were also student-centered. When we asked many of the pioneers, what was it that kept you doing this work? The answer was, it was working with my students. And at the end of my remarks, we'll have the privilege of hearing from some students here today at Michigan State to continue that tradition. So the path that the pioneers made was their own and widely varying, and many of the pioneers not only had no roadmaps, many of them actually left very few roadmaps. So what were the programs then that the pioneers produced? As we look through the literature of what were the precursors of service learning, if we include the term service learning, we came up with 27 different precursors. So often, it took me a while being trained as an organizer and a change agent, and to be cynical about when people said, "We've done that already." My first reaction is, "Yeah, right, you're just resisting change." But to realize that service learning did not spring full-blown out of the Academy's brain, but had many precursors on different campuses and nationally. And so out of that came the program that known as service learning, and not coincidentally, many of the different service learning programs have different emphases, or here at Michigan State, at different points in time, it had one or more emphases, and I've represented those as a hub and spokes rather than a linear line, because at some point, several of these were operating, whether it was volunteerism or student development or career development or academic learning. And again, the narratives are rich, that in certain times the concern was to connect to courses. At other eras, particularly during those periods when careerism seemed to be very prevalent among our students, was to connect to career development and career aspiration. If service learning didn't come without precursors in terms of time, it also in space shared a lot of connections with a lot of other programs, both nationally but especially on this campus. And I just quickly want to note these for the historical record. And again, you can look these up for those of you who want a real historical understanding of these. But The first was the STEP program, and again, I was here most recently a year and a half ago to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the STEP program and its work in partnering with Rust College in Holly Springs, Mississippi. But certainly in that program was the question of how to make change, how to connect to civil rights, how do Michigan State students make a difference. Justin Morrill College in the late 60s, early 70s was a place where experiential learning and many of the principles of Justin Morrill College became incorporated into the service learning courses in now the Center for Outreach and Engagement. Michigan Campus Compact had its birth here at Michigan State in the 1989-1990 year. I think that's one of those, the birth date is, could be either year depending when you date the origin, but I think that's an important part to remember, and how it was connected with the Service Learning Office, and I believe it was, help me Amy, the second campus compact in the country, somewhere in the, yeah, I know, these things, it's just, you know, I live in New England, and in the summer I volunteer as a history docent, and in order to say this building is the oldest in, the list of qualifications is longer than what you have to say about the history of the building. In the early 90s, there was a national program that was very active on this campus called COOL, and that's not an adjective, but it's an acronym for the Campus Opportunity Outreach League, and they sponsored Into the Streets. In fact, those of you who were looking at the slideshow, there were some Into the Streets slides there. There were connections with Alternative Spring Break, both as part of and in addition to, there was the Young Spartans program that was a very focused way to work with kids in the children in the Lansing schools. One of the contributions of the local work here was in the 90s, there were some people who said, you know, what role do the humanities, particularly literature, language, and writing, have to do with service learning? And I think one of the suspicions was that those of us who were trained as sociologists and social scientists were taking over the service learning movement. David Cooper and some of his colleagues in the Writing Center really did pioneering work on community-based writing and writing as part of service learning courses. I'll go through these last few since they're more recent, and I'm not exactly sure of all the dates, but we have the University Office of Outreach and Engagement and the National Center for the Study of University Engagement that is sponsoring this, and now is the umbrella under which the Center for Service Learning and Civic Engagement exists. There's the Public Humanities Collaborative in the College of Arts and Letters. There's the Bailey Scholars Program, which I visited a couple years ago and I thought was 2 or 3 years old, and I was just told that they celebrated their 10th anniversary last weekend. So I stand corrected, Diane. It should be up further on the chronological list if we're worried about chronology. But interesting, I think, you know, it does take more than a village to create a service learning program. It does take a whole university, and I'm sure there are many more slides of program connections that I've missed either because of time or I don't know about them, but the fact of the matter is that embeddedness is part of the path of the pioneers here and elsewhere, as if nothing else out of the necessity of loneliness would be to find fellow travelers. You look at the founding documents of the Society for Field Experience Education, which started in 1971. They first met in Florida. Again, John Dooley was one of the people who was there. And the narratives from that conference was that people were amazed to find there were other people on the planet who did what they did, because they were often the only person on their campus. So it was a validation as well as what we would now come to call networking. In 1989, there was a conference at Wingspread called the Wingspread Declaration for the Principles of Good Practice in Linking Serving and Learning. What was important about that, at least from my view, is that 70 organizations came together to put together this declaration of principles. And I remember in some of my early training as a community organizer, there was a mantra that an event is a success if the list of sponsors is longer than the list of the attendance list. And that was certainly the case here by about the same odds as were given earlier. There's room for about 35 people at Wingspread, and 70 organizations sent representatives. The preamble to that document, which I would argue is still the promise of service learning, I've come to call it the central claim. Maybe I spent too many years as an almost philosophy major. But in the 70s, there was a National Center for Service Learning, which disappeared during some of the political reorganizations of the 1980s and shifts in priorities about government at the national level. But it was called the Synergist. And essentially, I think that one way to look at the history of the Service Learning Center here in the movement nationally is this central principle, that the reason we link service and learning together is that they add value to each and they transform both. In fact, when some of us were looking at how would we frame research when we did the first national study, we decided this was the way to frame that. So what are some of the specific promises? To promise to transform higher education. A long time ago, a number of people wrote that if service learning was just a pedagogy, it would be left on the field of littered pedagogies that have been in the academy, or the fad du jour, as we like to do in some of our pedagogies. But that it's an important part of how we continue to respond to the society as institutions of higher education. I was asking today about the budget environment in Michigan right now for higher education, because everywhere I travel there's this game that our support from the legislature as a state institution is less than yours. It'd be, you know, my situation's worse than yours. And I thought I had 12% as the bottom, but somebody told me the other day in some state they think theirs is going to be less this year. But I was talking to some people about doing a workshop in a couple weeks about service learning, and somebody said, you know, I don't think this is a good time because we're all demoralized by the budget cuts, there have been layoffs, programs are being cut. And my argument was, well, you know, there's some link between how we're perceived and what the public trust and the social contract between the society and higher education. So I think the continuing promise of service learning, particularly in public universities, but not exclusively, is to regain that public trust. It certainly came under fire in the 80s with books like Prof Scam and complaints about tuition and that all we do is research. Related to that is it has the promise of revitalizing civic life. One of the exciting bits of data out of the primary election season, for those of you who watch, most of you probably watch the results, I've been watching the data on youth voting. And the youth voting in primaries is about double of what it was in 2004. And again, within that, students who are college, have some connection to a college, are twice as likely, more than about 3 times as likely to vote as students who are that age but not connected. So I think we really do have a role in civic life. Practicing democracy. I think one of the ways to look at the history of the Center for Service Learning is how democratic, small d, it has been in terms of student involvement and community partner involvement. And I think in many campuses, the Service Learning Center has challenged notions of hierarchy. It's a way to refocus faculty work, to not only have our students do service, but to have a way to give shape to faculty. And it's a way to continue to engage students. And again, in the interview with Mary Edens, I said, what keeps you at this? She'd been doing this work for about 20 years. And she said, it's the students, it's the energy, it's the outcome, it's what they contribute, and it's what they do, and how they share that. So what are the challenges? How do we retain the vitality of the margins while we are certainly part of the institution and institutional priorities? I think that's a challenge here. How do we have the vitality of the margins when we do strategic planning? Something I think none of the pioneers would ever admit to having done. That would violate that path. There have been calls for rigor as well. There should be in higher education. But how do we balance that rigor with the vigor and the vitality? That's another one. Similarly, how do we escape from being routine? Tim Stanton has written that it was the vision that moved the pioneers, and visions are rarely routine. So how do we keep the promise and meet the challenge of routine? At the same time, how do we have a purposeful evolution? And then finally, and I know this here in mid-Michigan, knowing where north is not a problem. I found that out one Friday afternoon when I was trying to drive north of here. Seems everybody knows where north is on Friday, up north is on Friday afternoon. But what is our vision? What is our view of true north? And how do we follow that point on the compass? I'll do these quickly. Obviously, there's a faster speed. But as we've put together this history, we've tried to look at the decades, and decades are always artificial constructs for social events. But that really where we are now in the 21st century is it's a time of maturity, and it's also a time of making even greater connections and broader emphasis. So the path ahead for the next 40 years is a question of how to make new paths for service learning and civic engagement. And I leave that with you as a discussion question for engagement. How do you do it at Michigan State? How do we do it in higher ed? What will Michigan State continue to contribute to the movement in service learning and civic engagement as it has so richly over the past 40 years? Also for the global village, some of you know that the International Association for Research on Service Learning and Civic Engagement had its international conference here, hosted by Karen Casey and her staff in 2005, and there were people here from over, I think, 30 different countries. So I think the paths for service learning over the next 40 years may not all be on terra firma, but they may be across oceans and in other planets and other cultures. Thank you.